Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stacy Moran. I'm the director of the Applied Theory Initiative. The title of today's event, Life in Crisis, feels especially resonant right now. We're living through no shortage of crises, maybe even poly-crises, as they say, political, ecological, institutional, existential, and yet one of the promises of critical thought is that it asks us not only to name crisis, but to think more carefully about what we mean by it, how it's lived and governed, and what kinds of life and subjectivity it produces. And I think today's conversation will help us do exactly that. The Applied Theory Initiative was designed as a space for conversations that explore how theory might circulate through lived experience. We're interested in forms of thought that move across disciplines and practices. We don't apply theory, it's a bit of a misnomer. We don't apply theory to the world, but instead explore the various ways that theory shows up in the world. That's part of why today's event feels so meaningful to us and why we're especially glad to be hosting it. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Center for Philosophical Technologies, for helping making this event possible. The CPT has created an important intellectual home for experimental and transdisciplinary inquiry here at ASU and throughout all its many global projects. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam Nocek, who is the center's founding director, who will introduce our speakers.
Hand off. Okay, thank you. This is great. Thanks, Stacy. To have both Gabby and Greg here today. Partly because it's a little bit of a generational panel, because transgenerational panel because
use the correct nomenclature.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Gabby, some of you may know, Gabby was Gregg's mentor, and Gregg was my mentor, so we have sort of generations here of mentorship, which is very exciting, and it's always great to have Gabby and Gregg here. I'm going to just do very short introductions. You probably did read the bios, but I will go through them again. Gregg Lambert will be speaking first, and the title of his talk is The Three-Body Problem of Biopolitics Today. Gregg Lambert is Dean's Professor of Humanities and founding director of the Syracuse University Humanities Center and the Central New York Humanities Corridor, which was established by a permanent matching endowment by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. In addition to the above, well, there's many, many titles in his oeuvre. He is the author of numerous works on contemporary continental philosophy and critical theory, especially on the philosophers Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. And then next will be Gabriele Schwab, and she is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Irvine. She holds appointments in the departments of comparative literature, anthropology, English and European languages and studies. She received her PhD in literary studies and critical theory at the University of Constance, and she has a PhD in psychoanalysis from the New Center for Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Heisenberg Fellowship, and her research interests include critical theory, psychoanalysis, trauma studies, literature, and anthropology, and 20th and 21st century comparative literatures. Her monographs in English, this was actually cut off. Anyways, she has numerous monographs in English. Let's just put it that way. Too many to count. And I'm sure if you are attending tomorrow's seminar, you will hear much more about that as well. So without further ado, please welcome Gregg Lambert.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Stacy. I thank the Institute as well. Thank you, Gabby, my doctorate Mutter. And this is also a bit of an extension of a transgenerational project that started in 2010 called the Society for Biopolitical Futures that Adam, Stacy, and Gabriele have all participated in at different stages and phases. So this comes out of a rethinking of the concept of biopolitics, was drawn from Foucault, during that period and problematizing that concept in the way it's been received and applied by contemporary philosophy, including the Italian philosophers. And it has evolved quite a bit and recommenced now with Adam starting to be the convener of it in its next phase, which will include apparently what we're planning is an event that will occur in Seoul next fall. That will be more Pan-Asian or Trans-Asian and encompassing. So the talk that I'm going to give today is the concluding section of my forthcoming book, which concludes called The Immanence of a Crisis, which will appear in the Posthumanities series of UMP, University of Minnesota Press, at the end of this year. And it's the concluding volume of what I'm calling the Four Elements trilogy, which is an actual term for a trilogy that exceeds the original scope of 3 volumes. That includes the earlier works, Philosophy After Friendship, The Elements of Foucault in 2020, and The World Is Gone, which is a meditation on the pandemic. And the final volume, which is, I'll read from the conclusion, begins with a commentary called Crisis, What Crisis?, surrounding the widespread protests and uprisings during the first full year of the lockdowns between March 2020, linked to the pandemic-related issues and broader social grievances, which I conclude with the January 6th protest insurrection in 2021. So it was written. And actually, I concluded the book last year, a day before the election of Trump. So during this period of time that I focus on in examining the concept of crisis, I'll just tabulate there were over 700 protests globally, with 230 protests in 110 countries during the first year of the COVID-19 lockdowns. Major protests included prison riots, anti-government demonstrations, social justice movements like Black Lives Matter. Protests mainly targeted authoritarian regimes, economic hardship, police brutality in many countries, and including feminicide, and the pandemic restrictions themselves. Notable protests included the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. However, many protests were driven by economic distress, including in Iran, social miseries and perceived mishandling of the pandemic, including in China, rather than the unified revolutionary consciousness of a movement, let's say, of insurrection. In the introduction that I distributed, but you can ask Adam or Stacy for it, called Crisis, What Crisis?, which is based on an album title from 1975 by the rock band Supertramp. I take up the idea first proposed by Etienne Balibar in a Zoom lecture given at Birkbeck in July 2020, right at the early stage of the lockdowns, concerning the social unrest of the pandemic, including the BLM protests that were occurring at that moment a month later. Balibar suggested insurrections are contagious, spreading across borders, inspired by shared vulnerabilities. The pandemic revealed a global species divided by inequalities but united by common existential threats. The concept he attempted to draw parallels to the 1968 student protests, as well as the weakening of state control and biopolitical power that has facilitated the spread of social protests globally, but which may not reflect the mixture of life and death concerns and the demand for new social structures of governance. I will now read from the conclusion of my reflections of the relationship between historical insurrections and what Balibar called revolutionary strivings, by referring to yet another insurrection that appears from the very beginning of Lao Shixin's contemporary science fiction masterpiece, The Three-Body Problem, the Chinese Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 76. The first chapter, called The Madness Years, takes place in Beijing at the very first year of the Cultural Revolution, when members of the Revolutionary Red Guard were seizing the headquarters of the April 28th Brigade, composed of students and the new Red Guard members who had become too radical in their revolutionary strivings, even for Mao's initial program against all bourgeois roaders. Quote, compared with the weathered men and women of the first generation of the Red Guards, who were born only a year before, in 1966, The new rebels were a pack of wolves on hot coals, crazier than crazy, unquote. In other words, the initial revolutionary strivings of the one-year-olds had a year later become tempered by the revolutionary tours around the country and seeing the Chairman Mao in the great rallies of Tiananmen Square. Therefore, they had grown a little more cautious than the newborns in their fanatical zeal for exterminating all the remaining traces of the four olds. The sublime figure of these new revolutionary strivings is represented in the first scene of the novel by a beautiful young girl who emerges on the top of a building waving a giant red banner and shouting slogans into a megaphone, until the army of Red Guards shoots her and then throws her slender and lifeless body off the roof, where it is impaled on one of the front gates of the school and then used for target practice by the rest of the guards below. Nevertheless, in these moments, at least she dies in the passionate throes of intense satisfaction. Quote from Whitehead, not about the Chinese Revolution, but at this point in the novel, the narrator intervenes by observing that, quote, battles like this one raged across Beijing like a multitude of CPUs working in parallel, their combined output, the Cultural Revolution, unquote. At this point, we are introduced to the main protagonists, Yi Wenji, the daughter of Yi Zhitai, a physicist of quantum physics at Tsinghua University, who is accused of being a reactionary academic authority by another splinter cell of the Red Guard that was formed by the university students for, among other crimes, teaching the theory of quantum mechanics. Science is whatever the party it says it is, and the laws of quantum mechanics runs contrary to the principles of how Marxism seeks to understand nature. Yi Wenji is the first shown in the middle of the mob in a reenaction or a TV drama that was recently produced, being held by two janitors in the university who fear for her life, and witnesses her father being beaten by a gang of 14-year-old girls from the junior high school attached to the university until he eventually dies with blood oozing from his head onto the stage. In the next chapter, called Silent Spring, Yi Wenji is in one of the labor camps of Inner Mongolia, along with 100,000 Chinese people, mostly former members of the professional classes and the academic classes and their families, as well as students who no longer had universities to go to and were sent to be re-educated, including in real life the young Xi Jinping. It is here that she is first introduced to the witnesses the radar peak with its giant dish pointing at the sky. Because her background in astrophysics is discovered by the guards, she eventually finds herself working there as a technician in the transmission main control room on what turns out to be a project of the People's Liberation Army to contact extraterrestrials with radio signals broadcasted into space from the giant array. Rather than re-narrate the entire novel, although I'd love to re-narrate this entire novel, I will skip to the crucial scene after which many years of attempting to contact the aliens under the suspicious eyes of the Red Guards, Yi Wenji finally receives a response from Alpha Centauri, which reads, "This world has received your message. I am a pacifist in this world. It is the luck of your civilization that I am the first to receive your message. I am warning you, do not answer, do not answer, do not answer. There are tens of millions of stars in this direction. If you do not answer, this world will not be able to ascertain the source of your transmission. However, if you answer, the source will be located immediately, your planet will be invaded, your world will be conquered. Do not answer." For the next few hours, Yi Wenji watched the transmission that continued on the screen in front of her, telling about the history of this world, the existence of Trisolarists, a civilization that had to be reborn repeatedly because of the three-body problem of the trisolar star system. And ultimately, it was a long-term plan to migrate to another galaxy that was more stable in its solar system, where the civilization could finally flourish without suffering from intervening periods of chaos, when the elliptical orbits of the three suns strayed off course and destroyed the worlds in their solar system. Given her own experience of the instability of the political systems on Earth, and especially the traumatic memory of watching her father beaten to death by a group of 14-year-old girls during the Cultural Revolution, which was only followed by her life in a labor camp, and survived under the constant surveillance of the Red Guards as a slave, ENG ultimately decided to send the following reply, despite the warning that would inevitably happen to her world as a result. She said, "The message that was winging its way to the sun said, 'Come here. I will help you conquer this world. Our civilization is no longer capable of solving its own problems. We need your force to intervene." Unquote. As one might imagine, ENG's invitation was received, and a fleet of giant spaceships was immediately dispatched from Alpha Centauri loaded with Trisolarians to colonize Earth. It will take 450 years for them to arrive. Meanwhile, after murdering the Red Guards at the station, who also had knowledge of the message, ENG escapes and begins to proselytize her message concerning the existence of the Trisolarians and the news of their eventual arrival in 450 years. This news spreads rapidly, mostly among the highly educated and elite classes, as well as the political and economic global elites, who, like ENG herself, either developed a strong force of alienation from the human species and thus a willingness to aid the approaching Trisolarians in the extinction of the human race, or had a deep spiritual feelings of yearning and an adoration for the coming of a more advanced society, for whom Alpha Centauri became a new Mount Olympus, populated by the gods, and this group became a spontaneous social bond of the newly founded Trisolarian religion. Along with Mike Evans, a trans-species communist who ENG first met in the deforested regions of Inner Mongolia near the radar station, they became the first members of the ETO, the Earth Trisolarian Organization, whose official charter was, quote, "to invite Trisolarian civilization to reform human civilization, to curb the malignant anthropocentric madness and evil, so that Earth can once again become a harmonious, prosperous, and sinless world." Unquote. Of course, as with any party organization, a strong factionalism soon appeared between the ideological motives of the different spiritual nobles, as they were called, that also echoed the different factions of the Cultural Revolution recounted above between the Red Guards and the April 28th Brigade, or the factionalism that developed in the early period of the French Revolution between the Girondins and the Jacobins. The first extreme faction was represented by Evans himself, who formed the Adventists, whose pure hatred of the human species was nihilistic and mainly used other factors such as the destruction of the environment, climate change, or species extinction as justification for their extreme hatred of humanity. As the narrator observes regarding this faction of ETO, some members, quote, even raised their hatred to very abstract and philosophical levels, unquote. Thus, the inclusion of communism in the ideology of trans-species communism might be understood as an effect of a metonymic slippage in the chain of signifiers, in which the class enemy of traditional Marxism is simply replaced by the human species itself as the ultimate universal enemy of all species, whose extinction would be morally justified as a final end of the revolution of all species against a dominant aggressor. Moreover, this would allow for the movement to maintain a certain political consistency that inspired the interest of the members to join, providing the group with an ideological form of revolutionary politics, even though there is no political content to be found anywhere, at least in the sense of the practical revolutionary politics of the state. Here, Lau might be reflecting on the very abstract philosophical levels that have also emerged recently on the fringes of the philosophies of new materialism, ecological nihilism, and the Anthropocene, who propose species extinction in some way also as a final solution to the problem of anthropocentrism. After confirming the existence of alien invasion of the alien fleet, the surviving war became one of the most natural human. Surviving the war became a natural human desire. Of course, that war would not occur in another 450 years, and had nothing to do with those who were living today, generationally. But many people hoped that if humans did lose, at least their descendants, who were alive in 4.5 centuries, could survive, Thus, serving the Trisolarian invaders would help achieve this goal. Compared to the other two factions, the survivors tend to come from lower social classes. Most were from the East, especially China. Although their numbers were small, they were rapidly increasing. As Trisolarian culture continued to spread, it would become a force that could not be ignored in the future of this movement. At this point, however, I will abruptly end my paraphrase of Cixin Lao's novel and strip this narrative of all traces of science fiction, which I do not believe is necessary, actually, and obscures the real social and political meaning of the narrative. In other words, we do not need 200, 400 Trisolarian spaceships slowly winging their way to our solar system and due to arrive in 450 years. And in the last part, Yi Wenji's transmission can therefore be decoded as follows. Our civilization is no longer capable of solving its own problems. Only an AI can save us. So if I began these reflections with 1975 album by Supertramp, Crisis, What Crisis, it seems fitting to conclude the study. This is the concluding part of the book, which has a coda which I won't read today, by quoting a few lyrics from the album also released in the same year, 1975, by Pink Floyd, called Wish You Were Here. Welcome to the machine, my son. Welcome. In the conclusion of my study, now I kind of move out of this allegory and into my own theory or my own philosophy. In the conclusion of my study of the traditional concept of what constitutes the concept of a crisis, I return to a crucial passage that marked the problem from which my original investigation set out some 5-6 years ago after I concluded the Elements of Foucault in 2020 and came upon the concept of the concept of the milieu in Lamarckian biology, which is adapted by Canguilhem, later the philosopher of science, and then by Foucault in his lectures on biopolitics. Once again, it occurs in the very first seminar of the 1978 lecture course by Foucault. The sovereign will be someone who will have to exercise power at the point of connection where nature, in the sense of the physical elements, interferes with the moral nature of the human species. At that point of articulation where the milieu becomes a determining factor of the concept of nature itself. This is where the sovereign will have to intervene if he wants to change the human species. It will be by acting on the milieu, which can also be translated as the environment, the middle, the intermediate place between organism and external environment. As Foucault goes on to explain what will become the main theme of his lectures the following year, called Birth of Biopolitics, he says that, I think here we have one of the axes of a fundamental elements of dispositive of mechanisms of security. That is not to say, not yet the appearance of a notion of milieu, but the appearance of a project of a political technique that will be addressed, called biopolitics, that will be addressed to the milieu in order to change the human species, including AI and technology. Artificial intelligence would be one of these techniques that belongs to the new logic of security today and of governmental security, political security, and so forth. Interrogating this passage further, we might ask, what is sovereignty here except an idea of power that occurs precisely at the intersection between the nature of the natural world, defined by causality and laws of physical systems, and the moral nature of the human being, which has, or the anthropomorphic nature of the human being, which has been defined since Kant by the moral idea of inner freedom as a form of causality that is supposedly unique to this species alone. That is, the idea of a free causality, of a spontaneity of free will. Has not the entire theory of sovereignty since Hobbes been targeted precisely at this intersection between the two natures of nature? This is why I included mention or concept of Whitehead's concept of nature as a corrective to the Kantian and the early Hobbesian theories of nature, as well as the Darwinian theories of nature. I think that Lamarck is helpful in this regard. If we remember, Lamarck emerged in the 19th century and then was even actually coining the term biology, and then quickly was repressed and disappeared by the triumph of Darwinism and in the social sciences as well as in biology. My question would be, what does Foucault mean when he says the idea of the intersection between the two natures of nature is not yet the appearance of a notion of the milieu, but rather an ongoing project of sovereignty? In my review, this statement can have no other meaning than the invention of multiple political techniques, or what I have called dispositive strategies, that belong to the historical development of a specific modern form of discipline and security, which can no longer be referred to a traditional order of sovereignty and to the state, but actually exceed the instruments and the logic of the state existing in other technologies and institutions that the state itself utilizes. This is precisely why Foucault argues at the end of the lecture course, which has been dubbed The Birth of Biopolitics, that the genealogy of the mechanisms of security and biopolitical despotisms do not have a circular ontology of the state apparatus that is growing like a huge monster in science fiction, an image that has also been recently applied to the technology of artificial intelligence. This last reference by Foucault is addressed to two contemporary revisions of Hobbes' original portrait of the state as an artificial leviathan. The original portrait of the state that was offered by Deleuze and Guattari in their published writings in the 70s, beginning with Anti-Oedipus, and the other revision by Althusser, the Marxist, in his earlier writings on the state apparatus in Lenin philosophy. Foucault's own portrait of the state reveals a central trunk in place of an organic body that is now thoroughly disorganized, having many of its limbs and organs growing outside its former body, and now functioning somewhat independently, at least in a manner over which the state does not have complete control. Since there is no organic model for this body, I would say that the contemporary state resembles a being suffering from essential myoclonosis, someone who can't control their own organs. If I were to draw a picture of our new Leviathan, therefore, I would say that the sovereign today resembles a figure with two bodies and a missing head. And this returns in the transition from classical political philosophy to the postmodern question concerning the missing head itself, in the sense of Derrida's question, who or what class today is heading or conducting the state? Who is driving, conduire in French, which is the notion of conduire that Foucault utilizes. Who is driving civil society? Who is the spiritual conductor of this orchestra? The artificial head that is propped up to replace the missing head, often by philosophy and ideology, of the organic sovereign, the monarch or trump, is partly vegetable, a rhizome, and partly an animal face from ancient religious myths and children fairy tales. And this is what Deleuze also intuited earlier on in Difference and Repetition, when he said, tyrants have the heads not only of beasts, but of pears, cauliflowers, and potatoes. Of course, this does not mean, like in the short story by Washington Irving, the missing head of the sovereign cannot sometimes return on horseback at midnight wearing the cape of Hegel's world historical individual, a quote that I recently ascribed to Trump. This is certainly a rare occurrence in history, however, but in the long period between these figures' multiple incarnations, given the apparent absence of a center or central figure of sovereignty, the question becomes which order organizes real social space, and how are the three orders of sovereignty, discipline, and security oriented towards the mobile and supernumerary bodies of a population, and at the same time, how these three bodies are organized by the state as the focal point of decision, executive decision. In response to this last question, throughout the study, I define Foucault's concept of biopolitics as actually comprising of three interdependent and overlapping strategies, all of which target the milieu, at the intersection between the two natures of nature, and the two natures of the environment, as well as the body of the population, multiple bodies of the population, collective bodies, so forth, which the pandemic released in some way, made visible. If we apply the three-body problem from classical mechanics to this allegory, we must conclude that the resulting system is dynamic and chaotic in its conditions. Moreover, since there is no other way of calculating the movements of the three orders, or the three bodies, it would make sense to say that what Foucault originally attempted to theorize by the concept of biopolitics was modern biological strategies that are incorporated into technological theories, and the increasing dependence on numerical methods of calculation and representing causal relationships between the three bodies of sovereignty, discipline, and security. For example, what is called population is simply a numerical object in Whitehead's sense, or in Spinoza's original meaning, a multitude, an indefinite numerical set abstracted from living real bodies in society, comprised of both organic and artificial elements, all of which inhabit the same milieux. In other words, Foucault portrays the breaking up of a centralized image of state power through the creation of new mechanisms of security. However, the milieu is an intersection of the first two orders, producing a third body that is constructed by events that also pass through, like the pandemic, like the contingency of a virus, like accidents, like war, like the miscalculation of war, and so forth, that basically problematize this order as in any way having a relation to do with decision. In the previous section that I have not read on counterconducts, I already summarized Foucault's brief comments on so-called counterconducts, which are only consisted actually of a 5-minute summary remarks at the end of one lecture. And this is the sovereignty capitalizes a territory, discipline encloses a space, but biopolitics plans a milieu. And I'm going to skip down so that I'm going to end on 40 minutes. We could say that if the traditional problem of sovereignty and thus of political power is linked to sovereignty, had in the past always been that of conquering new territories or holding on to a conquered territory, then the problem was, in a way, how can it not change? Or how can I not advance without it changing? How can a territory be demarcated, fixed, protected, or enlarged? In other words, it involves something that we call the safety, sûreté, of the sovereign who rules the territory. That's the first order. Second, we see from the above description the classical problem of sovereignty. There is a certain double register with the problems that later concern what we call security of the state and as well as the institutions that the state operates or controls, that are either located internal to a given territory or to discipline the subjects of criminality and the insane, but also in the periphery and the knowledge employed by colonial administrative institutions from the 19th century and 20th century to manage other global populations, including populations in the developing world. Finally, this brings us to a third body in the three-body problem of biopolitics today, which I have implicitly portrayed throughout my study as the existence of a trans-individual body of a mob that lives inside of us all and is immanent. This is what Spinoza originally intended by the term multitude, as a numerically indistinct form of individuality, which is why this original concept does not refer to a people or a populace, and certainly not to the concept of a common class, vulgaris or plebeian. It is rather an imminent danger represented by this third acephalic body that suddenly explodes from within the milieu at the intersection between the two natures that the state seeks to control with its instruments, that sometimes can, in a sense, cause the state to lose control of its own three-body problem. Concerning the imminent nature of this third body, I will now return to the post-insurrection or the protest or insurrection of January 6th, 2021, which I argued in my introduction marked exactly the middle of a crisis. In other words, we are still in the end of a crisis, that constituted the middle, including the election of Trump being part of that result. One such historical association I referred to is the insurrection of 1672 called Rampjar in the Dutch Republic, which brought about the collapse of the Dutch Republic. That was the subject of Spinoza's final treatise, which he was writing before he died. As Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire, all great historical events and personages appear twice. First time as tragedy, the second time as a farce. According to our farce, what the initial began as a protest, what initially began as a protest, or a right-wing staged version of an Occupy movement to obstruct the election or even turn it over, quickly end as a failed insurrection that was reported by the media. The principal character was Trump himself, who played the role of William III of Orange in our farce, and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who played the brothers DeWitt. The historical parallel raises some interesting questions. Like William III, was Trump behind the insurrection? Did he order the state and federal police to stand down in the early hours of the mob storming the building? Or if the occupation had been more successful, would the mob have dragged both Schumer and Pelosi out to the Capitol steps, lynched them, and then afterwards roasted their livers to eat them in a frenzy? Of course, the Dutch are historically renowned, both for their culture of tolerance, but also for their excessive capacity for violence. Finally, if they had been better organized rather than a mere riotous mob, would they have occupied the Senate, issued several public edicts and reforms, including the purging of the Democratic governors, of the elected officials in the states of New York, Michigan, California, Georgia, and Pennsylvania? Although these events would make a very good alternative reality series on Netflix, the political parallels between the events of 2021, 1672, are compelling enough to warrant a very similar conclusion to Spinoza's own sober observations concerning the role of the passions of the multitude that are subject to political calculation, that is, to calculation by sovereignty, in order to stage a revolt. As Spinoza observed, in a time of crisis, something happens which returns the state to a principle upon which it was established. Although the primary conclusion that he draws in the Political Tractatus from the actual events in 1672 was that the insurrection led to the collapse of the Dutch Republic is the weakness of the constitution of the Republic itself, its own constituted Republican form. There is another external cause that Spinoza only mentions in passing, but which can be interpreted to refer to a cause by natural disaster, plague, and pestilence, when each individual, according to Spinoza, is reduced to a state of fear and solitude by the overwhelming power of nature itself. There is no effect that is not sometime overcome by a stronger effect. And those who flee an enemy overawed by fear cannot be restrained by fear of anything else but rushing headlong into rivers or into fire to escape their enemy's steel. So however properly a state or a commonwealth is set up, however its walls, still in the greatest crisis of a state, when everyone is seized by panic, as often happens, and everyone approves only what the present fear urges without giving any consideration to the future or to the laws. In this case, the state's sovereignty occurs as if by some inevitable fate. You can see I'm making a lot of kind of associations here I don't want to draw out explicitly in this context. But let me go to the conclusion now in the last 5 minutes. According to what I have defined earlier in my writings, Spinoza's regressive theory of the state form, Spinoza actually argued against Hobbes that all societies begin as democracies, then become aristocracies, and finally monarchies. And that is the end of democracy. This contradicts the implicit interpretations of the Political Tractatus that have been given by many Marxist theorists throughout the last 30 years. So one of the things that I'm trying to deal with. Finally, let's return to Spinoza's original proposition. In a time of crisis, something happens when the return of a state to a principle on which it was established. I'm not going to go here because this is I'm going to talk about this in the January. I will go here. I'll end it here. Okay. In the case of the January 6th insurrection, since the constitutional form of democracy of the United States was not originally established as a monarchy, although one could argue it was an aristocracy, the original principle upon which the United States was established returns us to the revolutionary situation of a free and independent multitude. However, as was also the case in the Dutch situation, this has effectively split the multitude into two opposing minds, if not into two completely different third bodies. According to one mind and one body, the revolutionary aims of the BLM protest in 2021, the earlier 1619 Project, and the movements around LGBTQA rights seek nothing less than to reconstitute the constituent power of the law of the state itself in a very positive and affirmative way, if only to finally enfranchise those subjects, including those subjects that are being produced or created as part of the people, of the multitude today, in order to give them not only civil rights, but also political power, real political power. According to the opposing mind and body, the counter-revolutionary aim of Trump supporters like the Proud Boys who define themselves as patriots was to define the original constitution of sovereignty, but particularly the exclusion of blacks, immigrants, women, and transgender subjects from gaining any further franchise in the summa potestas, or potentia, of the state, of the democracy. That is, any real political existence. Of course, we need to remember the most fringe groups on the far right of the political spectrum of contemporary political civil society believe that they were oppressed and subjugated by the current constitution of state sovereignty, and this was the source of what Foucault called their counterconducts, counterconduire, including what Foucault calls as an absolute right to revolt. However, there's a final parallel that I'll conclude with between recent events and the events that took place in Holland in 1672, which occasioned the collapse of the true freedom, the true Dutch Republic. The winds that blew the mob in particular were also subject to political calculation of an elite political class, as in the case of also the Iranian Revolution that I discussed earlier in the book, or the strategic calculation of Mao in mobilizing the student body against the CCP during the period of the Cultural Revolution, the French Revolution of 1795 that ended with the arrival of Napoleon Bonaparte, or the Bolshevik-Leninist Revolution of 1917 that ended with the autocracy of Stalin. One could argue that this same principle of political calculation, sovereignty, including the speculative calculation conducted by some political philosophers today who continue, against all good advice, to play the great game of world revolutions from a distance of being a spectator, can be applied to every revolution in history as an axiom, including the current autocratic revolutions today globally. Accordingly, given that there is no moral compass between good and bad outcomes in the calculation of the third body, according to Spinoza's theory of the state form, perhaps we should have not been surprised by the arrival of Trump. Although there was a third wave of democratization following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, last minute, we are now amid a third wave of autocratization today. The world has fewer democracies, equal 88, than autocracies, today equal to 91 and growing. For the first time in over 20 years, liberal democracies have become the least common regime type in the world today, with a total of 29 in 2024. Nearly 3 out of 4 persons in the world, 72%, live in an autocracy. This is the highest figure since 1978. Belarus has recently descended into a closed autocracy again, becoming the first closed autocracy in Europe in 25 years. A specter is haunting Europe today. But the specter is not the specter of the coming communist society, nor even the specter of 19th century socialism, but rather the specter of liberal democracy itself. As I write this on November of 2024, November 3rd of 2024, there is still a glimmer of hope for revolutionary strivings in Venezuela and Iran. But this popular democratic movement against one of its survivals of Latin American socialism. However, because we have witnessed many more bad outcomes of revolutionary strivings than good ones in human history, by far, ultimately there's no moral compass that will guarantee that the next revolution will turn out to be for the best, nor the political class who will arrive one day, maybe in 450 years, to assume the role of the spiritual conductor will be any more peaceful, any more benevolent than the previous one. Therefore, I imagine that this maxim can be applied to our own time and to our own crisis, as well as to the future trisolarian society in our solar system in 450 years. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to do questions for Greg first, just because I think the talks are going to be quite different.
Yeah.
Comments?
I have a quick question. So, Greg, that was great. I'm a little bit horrified looking at the flayed DeWitt brothers behind your head. So my question is actually kind of Spinozist.
Yeah.
And I'll try to simplify the question. You took a passing dig at Marxist interpretations of Spinoza, and I take it you're thinking of Negri in particular. And yet,
Balabar as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yet I remain convinced by his distinction between potestas, power that is reactive, and potentia, that is power that is perhaps more active, less subject to bad passions, etc., etc. So as we try to navigate the milieu of the present moment with all of its crisis, the exploding, proliferating crises, as we try to judge, to play with the etymology of crisis, what to do, so the old Leninist question, what's to be done, how are you, why wouldn't you take the kind of negrist, I don't know how to make an adjective out of his name, Negrian emphasis on the potentia of thinking as a kind of first and necessary response? I mean, maybe that was in your very quick, I mean, you were moving very quickly there after your paraphrase. So help me think about what a philosophical Spinoza rather than the Spinoza of the Tractatus as a response to the crises.
Well, I mean, thank you. I mean, for the question, and I know that you have knowledge of Spinoza, certainly, and I've been a very careful and long reader of Spinoza's text. Yeah, it'd be a difficult question to answer, but it's because I refuse to make the distinction of the Spinoza at the end of his life after the Dutch Republic, the failure of the Dutch Republic, and his cautious and pessimistic sentiments about what, in a sense, what kind of state form would emerge after this. I think that kind of pessimism and political realism is what I'm emulating in this moment also, rather than a kind of revolutionary hope or...
Does that mean withdrawal?
No, it doesn't. No, it's not a Christian. I don't think that the talk has any withdrawal, any indication of withdrawal at all. In fact, it's an engagement. Also, we would have to have a long conversation, but Negri's reading is it is a misreading of Spinoza, even of the Ethics, and even of that passage fundamentally in the first passage of the Ethics, of the distinction between potentia and potestas. It's affirmative. It's an affirmative and hopeful axiomatic reading of the possibility of the greater possibility of potentia that outscores quantitatively the existing potestas of any form of power. I agree with that to some extent, but that's not, in a sense, how Spinoza understood it in all cases. Nor did he read potestas and potentia in exactly that way in other sections of the Ethics. So in my book, I have long sections where I engage not only with Negri but with Balibar on this question of revolutionary strivings, revolutionary hope, and how that serves us in a crisis to make decisions about what to do in the crisis. And you quoted Lenin. I'm also somewhat skeptical about Lenin's role in his response to the question of what is to be done, which was made in 1916 on the eve of the Russian Revolution, and led again the question of the political calculation of sovereignty, which has become, unfortunately, part of the genre of political philosophy in our contemporary political philosophy, and which I critique as a game of playing revolution by spectators, and not dealing with the real issues of what both revolution and counter-revolution entail in the existing and current conditions of populations and peoples in society today. And there are many that we could talk about. So a lot of my work for the last 15 years has dealt with the issue of war, and of real concrete wars, and of the cost of wars, and of a continued belief that we can manage and strategically calculate the end of war for good or bad, and for the interests of only one small hegemonic group. So I'm not a quietist, and I'm not a stoic, and I'm not a revolutionary.
I have a question actually from online. So I'm gonna read the question from online. So hopefully I can capture it. Let's see. I had to arrive late to Gregg's talk, so this person apologizes if they missed the answer to this question in advance. However, I'd like to ask him, if appropriate, is to extend on Spinoza's idea about a population reduced to fear by the power of nature. Is that meant as a prophecy of what we can expect from the looming environmental crisis? If so, what impact would you expect on U.S. politics? For example, more threats to democracy and an entree to autocracy?
That's a great question, and thank you for the question. It's already happened. What I'm trying to read and contemplate, and the books that I've written over the period of the pandemic, including The World Is Gone, which is a reflection on the experience of the pandemic, or the crisis of the pandemic. And as you point out, I'm rejecting the notion of crisis as a decision or a point of decision, as a traditional concept of crisis, because this refers to a mechanistic and even mechanical understanding of the nature of events in the universe, and the nature of even a political event. But the pandemic itself released, in the protests that occurred in that year, many third bodies, what I'm calling third bodies, many social protests that have wildly different causalities, that are situated in their environments, including economic causality, and including the police brutality, and including the enclosure of people and feminicide that occurred in domestic spaces. So it was the array of the different crises that was released by this, again, intersection of nature, in the sense of the physical elements of nature and the order of nature, into human nature. That sovereignty tries to intervene with a certain kind of moral force of decision in order to reassure, in order to punish, in order to judge. I think that the madness of our species is morality. And I think it's the insanity of our species is morality. But that's something I'll leave to my future books. But that judgment, that question of judgment or decision, is something that we have to reflect on very carefully because of the damage that it causes others. But the pandemic itself is an example in case of the environment and of the merging of the two natures, of the nature of the virus, of the physical nature, of the ecological destruction, but also ecological destructions that occur in war and contamination, and the resulting counter occurred in autocracies and in political attempts to maintain security, unstable security, and the drive towards autocracy as a result of trying to manage this crisis between the two natures, or the two natures of nature. So that's a great, that's, I would say, the essential question that my book, or actually what I'm calling the 4-part trilogy, is trying to address. And I've only addressed it in real time, existentially. I redefine myself now as an existentialist, partly because I'm assigned to teach existentialism for undergraduate students, and I found that in fact it's the most needed philosophy today for our undergraduate populations in their own lives. And so de Beauvoir, I end my book by going back to de Beauvoir's ambiguity of morals as a way of, in a sense, beginning again with a reflection on existence.
Any other questions?
I have several, but I think so you just reminded me that you started with the idea of the spreading of these insurrections or social movements, right? And you just said something that reminded me of that, where you were saying that they seem to be having different causes. But actually, what I'm really asking is, do all these movements, aren't they actually related, and not just converging, but globally in ways that we're actually not talking about? I mean, that's not a coincidence that we have the 60s, now we have this movement, right? Second short question is about, Naomi Klein's work?
Yeah, of course,
Shock
yeah.
doctrine.
Shock doctrine.
Yeah, so, her notion is, I understand, autocracy is not better than democracy, but democracy is also not perfect, right?
Yeah.
And we could also relate that to, like, what is the oncoming, what is this next thing that you're imagining, or that this science fiction novel is imagining? What happens after,
Well,
we arrive on this planet?
Again, and that's wonderful questions, and of course it goes way outside the scope of what I could do to leave time for Gabby's important talk on ecology and on the haunted ecologies. But first of all, it's precisely this question of a relation between all of these different events that I was trying to address, and how I was critiquing Balabar's precisely speculation at the very beginning of this, that all of these insurrections that were contagious, that they took on the metaphor of a virus or a viral contagion, and therefore that there was a unified proletariat consciousness or proletariat causality. But I reject that completely. I find that a mythical and ideological explanation. We don't have right now, we don't have a structural explanation of these contingent events they are of course all related, but they're related to the interior of the body of the living organism and of the bodies of living organisms in our milieu, including our own milieu. And I think that this is the reason why biology is becoming, again, within its new technological frame, which is also a danger, is becoming a new paradigm. And I think that philosophy is 30, I've been writing that philosophy is 30 to 50 years behind the phenomenology of these events. So it has no explanation, and it keeps on resorting to these old myths. And so that's the only kind of explanation I give you right now. But if you read the book, you can see it's like I'm really trying to erase it. This is why I go to the philosophy of Whitehead as a way of, in a sense, beginning to kind of try to articulate what is called the plane of events, the plane of events of a crisis.
Any other questions? I have one if no one else has one. I mean, this is just sort of, and I'm curious about your thoughts, and maybe So before you sort of transition to...
Do you want me to take the ramp jar off here?
Before you transition to the second part of your talk, you said, and it was just sort of an aside, that only AI can save us.
Yeah.
And
Well,
yeah,
okay.
But I assume, and maybe falsely, but I assume that was sort of a reference to Heidegger and the 1966 Der Spiegel interview where he said only God can save us. And the question there for him, of course, was that you have this encroaching technoscientific way of understanding rationality, and that only God can save us is not really a solution. It's, sort of kind of tongue-in-cheek, but, the seriousness, of course, has been debated of what Heidegger meant by that. And yet now it's only technoscience that can save us as your sort of tongue-in-cheek
Yes.
way out of this problem and trying to find our new spiritual conductor through something like technoscience. And
Artificial
I think
intelligence.
And I think it's interesting because, of course, you also take taking the piss, I guess you could say, out of people from, sort of materialist genealogies and this sort of I call them the sort of techno-literate left, who, sort of go whole hog into this idea that we need to think about technologies outside of, the social political conditions under which they were produced and begin to release them into the wild in more revolutionary ways. And I'm just wondering if sort of you could bring these two moments together, only God can save us and only AI can save us.
Yeah, well, I mean, this, again, would go far into Gabi's time, but I will try to...
We have like 5 minutes, so you're...
Okay. She's my...
Yeah, okay.
She's my doctorate motor. I can't. So in any case, yeah, of course, I was making a quip or a reference to Heidegger's quote. I mean, did he take his own quote seriously? Only a God can save us. And of course, given his thought on technology and the writings on technology, how dark that was of the gestalt and the enframing and so forth. Which I see that we're still working with some model of that in the paranoid relationship we have, popular culture to AI. This is a very, very long and very interesting discussion that we can have over many drinks, but in the last part of the book, I start to develop 2 different views of what in the German is Anlage. Predisposition or disposition of the species, which Kant uses in answering the question, is the human species not biologically determined, but as he said, as a universorum, as a species that is evolving continually and producing new peoples and new forms of government and new political contexts through the conflicts in history around the Middle East and so forth today. That there's a tendency of political theory to only think about humanity or the Anthropocene or only in our current, all at once in our current moment as a decision, instead of imagining that we're talking about transgenerationally, the future generation and evolution of our species in relation to artificial intelligence and in relation to the technologies that are not apart from us, but a part of us. And I have a more positive and hopeful understanding of that kind of evolutionary path that in a sense must include, in a sense, future evolution, a future generation of our human species to include as a result. And is AI evolving in a way that it will be utilized, as Foucault's thesis of biopolitics, in a very rudimentary and primitive and kind of like cartoony way, in the 70s was trying to designate, using statistics and different kinds of technologies and knowledges that were part of the university and became part of government, state control. But AI, how much will we give to AI to manage our political affairs because we can't manage them ourselves? And so that one statement by Yves Ng, we are not able to solve our own problems. We need your intervention. And that's when I use the term, only an AI will save us. And so I think it's an interesting set of associations that need to be drawn out and analyzed. And so this notion of disposition and predisposition, so Kant based this notion of Anlage on an embryo contains an inner dynamic teleology, organic teleology of the maturation of the adult, that he used as a metaphor to talk about the entire evolution of the human species, on the basis that there is a certain teleological design in on an embryo, on the level of the embryo, that there must be therefore that kind of presence of design on the entire species population, in terms of how species evolve.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you. And I'm going to leave the stage, so.
Now for Gabriele.
Okay, so let me begin by thanking, of course, Adam Nozick and Stacy Moran for putting this event together in the first place. I am so happy to be back at the ASU, and I was a fellow in residence at the Humanities Institute, unbelievably almost 20 years ago in 2009. And I have still friends from that time whom I'm very happy to see here also. So I will start with a few thoughts on haunted ecologies, which, by the way, is the title of a new book I'm currently completing. More specifically, I will talk about a politics of the death drive that performs what Achille Mbembe calls the work of death. Haunted ecologies are environments where past damage lingers both in material and psychic life, shaping landscapes, humans and species alike. Ecological destruction, whether through catastrophe or slow violence, produces death worlds where the harm to life becomes structurally embedded. Past damage reverberates across time, species, environments, and social structures, and the attempts at adapting to such harmful conditions induce somatic awareness, anticipatory anxiety, hypervigilance, and in extreme cases, dissociation. Designed to heighten the capacity to sense harmful substances and infrastructural hazards, these altered states can be understood as perceptual and effective readjustments that attune humans to the navigation of harmful environments. Toxic environments, extractive sacrifice zones, and degraded life worlds are the result of a necropolitical governance that systematically exposes populations to harm. As strategies of survival, humans as well as other species develop sensors of necropolitical harm that reflect the slow violence of ecological destruction. Enhanced perceptual ecologies have also been observed in animals as birds, fish, and urban wildlife navigate contaminated or destructive habitats. And one example that some of you might remember is the animals' anticipatory reactions to an earthquake. Animals are usually the first that react and get agitated long before humans sense the earthquake. But also there was the famous example of the bees and the wasps before the nuclear Chernobyl accident, The bees and wasps went underground days before any human knew that anything was going to happen. Specific states of hypervigilance can provide access to patterns of damaging environmental conditions and dangers that are often invisible to ordinary perception. And that's an important point I will come back to, that the attunement goes beyond ordinary perception. They can function as adaptive recodings, and this in Gregory Bateson's sense, of systemic information that facilitate the detection of environmental threats, and they provide epistemic tools to alert bodies and minds to harmful ecological conditions. From a psychoanalytic perspective, ecological attunement traces the internal reverberations of ecological trauma, countering the often unconscious repression of socially ignored or psychically unassimilable environmental damage. Under chronic ecological stress, people may remain frozen in paranoid, schizoid hypervigilance, or in the depressive position of unmitigated mourning. Functioning as forms of knowledge, registering culturally sanctioned harm, states of ecological attunement are both epistemic and political, and they function as the foundation of ethical responsiveness and planetary survival. I've been thinking about ecological attunement from the perspective of Gregory Bateson's ecology of mind. Bateson defined the unit of survival in terms of organism and environment. And we can expand this concept and think systemically or infrastructurally about the unit of survival in terms of system and environment. Most importantly, I think for me, I think that Bateson's concept also holds for psychic survival. How do we survive in the ruins of capitalism? Anna Zink asked in her seminal work. These days we may ask, how do we survive in the ruins of state terrorism? National and environmental politics together circumscribe our collective ecologies of mind. The ecological destruction of the planet is compounded by the current political situation. And it is no coincidence that one of the first actions Trump took in office was to dismantle the ecological regulations implemented by Biden, the few. I see today's politics as haunted by the politics of fascism, as we have seen it in many countries around the globe, but especially haunted by the politics in Nazi Germany. Elon Musk's Hitler salute and the Nazi-style coat worn by Greg Bovino, the senior border control official who enforced fascist ICE operations in Chicago and Minneapolis, are just the visible emblems of today's rise of fascism and state terrorism. Simultaneously, I see current environmental politics haunted by the specters of climate change and the so-called sixth extinction, the first large-scale extinction event in planetary history caused by human, or more precisely capitalist interventions in the order of things. With this background of environment in mind, I will now present a few ideas of this recently finished book manuscript titled Haunted Ecologies. Analyzing paradigmatic ecologies of trees, rivers, air, and wastelands, Haunted Ecologies theorizes current ecopolitics from the perspective of its necropolitical dimension, with a special emphasis on the ecology of mind. Environmental destruction and political violence often go together, and their long-lasting psychic effects on individuals and communities shape psychic, social, and political life. People as well as environments are haunted by ecological violence, often for generations to come. Certain populations are forced to live in a state of vulnerability or precarity, if not social abandonment. Governments decide whose lives are worth protecting and who is expendable and can therefore be subjected to violence or death. Under extreme conditions, this decision can become random, such as in the case of René Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis in January of 26. Governments decide who has a right to live in safety in the country and who can be detained or deported. Governments decide that they can detain and or deport children as young as 5 years old, as in the case of Liam Conejo Ramon, who lived in Columbia Heights, a suburb of Minneapolis, and was detained by ICE on January 26, while walking home from preschool with his father. As I write this, the staggering news reaches me that the infamous above-mentioned Bordar Homan claims he has just located 145,000 missing children that await being reconnected with their parents. First, if it were true, which is doubtful in the first place, what country is this that separates 145,000 children from their parents without any plan to reunite them? Also, where are these children now? What is happening to them? Where are their parents? In fact, a DHC investigation showed that over 323,000 children who illegally entered the US are completely unaccounted for. Where is the public outcry, nationally or internationally? If there is none, it can only mean that we have already normalized and internalized this country's necropolitical violence, even when it is directed at children. It can only mean that we have become complicit bystanders. Moreover, as the examples of Good and Preddy show, the lingering threat of death and violence can potentially affect anyone, operating as a form of intimidation and social control. As a result, a pervasive ecology of fear has become the psychological basis of necropolitics. The US today can be considered a paradigmatic site of necropolitics. Normal legal and moral codes are suspended and vulnerable populations are subjected to mass detention, deportation, and incarceration, as well as militarization and extrajudicial killings. Violence and death have become normalized as part of our social infrastructure. The vulnerable populations created by capitalist necropolitics, predominantly ethnic or racialized communities are vulnerable. They are forced to live under extreme poverty and often in environmental hazard zones and fence-line communities. Forced migration or premature deaths due to harmful living conditions and lack of health care are the new normal for these communities. Many of the people, mostly young non-white men, end up in the US prison industrial complex that Angela Davis has analyzed so pertinently. In short, the living conditions of these vulnerable populations create state-sanctioned zones of abandonment and necropolitical violence. Technology. Studies of environmental racism have shown how colonialism and capitalism have distributed degraded environments along lines of race and class. Deforestation, climate change, environmental pollution impact poor communities disproportionately. People living in zones of abandonment routinely experience precarity, displacement, and threats to their lives, both materially, psychologically, and transgenerationally, often over long periods of time. The ruins of capitalism are sites of both ecological and psychological violence that continue to haunt those who inhabit them, generating a pervasive haunting from the future of slow violence and increasing ecological destruction. In communities subjected to the violence of unbridled extractivism, displacements, deportations, ecological crisis, and collapse, the effects become legible by the traces they leave in the land, rivers, forests, or air, as well as in individual and collective psychic lives. In these contexts, then, ecological trauma spans across both individual and collective experiences, since haunted ecological spaces become entangled with haunted psychic spaces. Over long periods of time, these hauntings are not only experienced emotionally, but become embedded in neural circuits. Neuropsychoanalyst Mark Solms, for example, analyzed how our mental states, including emotions, desire, and the unconscious, are grounded in neural mechanisms. Becoming neurologically embedded, traumatic interactions between brain, body, and environment created by haunted ecologies demonstrate the link between mind and environment. Collective ecological trauma gets inscribed materially into damaged environment and landscapes, as well as individual bodies and mind. A concept of ecological trauma can thus productively grounded in an ecology of mind. Haunted ecologies are material and psychic spaces in which histories of violence are reenacted individually, socially, and transgenerationally, including inscriptions in neural circuits that shape how we think, feel, and act. And this is something important. Perhaps I can go into more detail in the discussion. Given the fact that necropolitical violence is both physical and psychological, the damage and wounds inflicted on the environment and the body also manifest in damage and wounds of the mind and the psyche. The examples I mentioned above are from the US, where I have lived for the past 40 years. But environmental destruction and necropolitical violence are rampant around the globe. What does our witnessing of the suffering of people and environments at a distance do to our psychic life and our ecology of mind? I'm thinking of one of the most devastating examples, the genocide of Palestinian people in Gaza. Military actions and blockades by the IDF have transformed Gaza and large parts of the West Bank into a ruinous zone of abandonment and devastation. Ecological harm compounds the humanitarian crisis and state of emergency. Gaza's water resources, treatment plants, and sewage facilities have been directly and cruelly targeted by military actions. Water sources have been contaminated by sewage and chemicals, leading to serious damage to health and the risk of illnesses and epidemics. Only 10% of Gaza's water is safe to drink. As a side effect, Palestine has lost a significant amount of arable land. The remaining agricultural areas have been targets of airstrikes and shelling. Farmers lose their livelihood and are forced to move. The population's food insecurity increased dramatically. Bombings have caused widespread fires in urban and rural areas. Pollution and the targeting of infrastructures such as oil storage facilities increase contamination. Coastal ecosystem and marine life are harmed by untreated water. And I have more examples, but I skip for the sake of time. Gaza can be taken as a paradigmatic example of Bateson's insistence that the unit of survival is a system and its environment. Psychic life in Gaza is impossible to separate from the environment of war, genocide, and ecological devastation. The population's ecology of mind is inseparable from Israel's genocidal politics. But psychic life more generally is inseparable from environmental conditions, including family environments, social environments, political environments. Destructive environments create altered states of mind. In extreme conditions, these manifest in alterations of brain functioning. According to Solms, feelings are what drives the mind's experiences. Under destructive environmental conditions, people live in chronically altered states of mind. We all know that anxieties, fears, and desires alter the ways we think and behave. Altered states are shaped by the unconscious that also regulates what we cannot tolerate and therefore repress, as well as what we mobilize to resist and intervene. This too is part of an ecology of mind that balances who we are and what we want to become. And now I will summarize a few things of the book Haunted Ecology, Haunted Ecologies, to give you a sense of where I'm going with this. Haunted Ecologies follows and expands the groundwork I laid in my earlier books, the one Haunting Legacies and the other Radioactive Ghosts. Haunting Legacies focused on transgenerational memories of violent histories, mainly with a focus on the aftermath of World War II. Haunted Ecologies, by contrast, asks how the violence of environmental destruction is transmitted within distributed ecological systems, including ecologies of mind. And the distributed ecological systems, I think about Prigozhin's distributed system. Environmental destruction produces forms of haunting that by far exceeds an anthropocentric temporal framework. As ecological sites and systems have become saturated with memories of violence, the future is haunted by the ghosts of the past that threatened the very ecologies on which planetary survival depends. The book Haunted Ecology views planetary life with a grammar of animacy that is mindful of the agency of all species with whom humans share the planet. This epistemological perspective of animacy resonates with a rich arsenal of indigenous epistemologies and animisms that inspire them. Endowing other species and environments with agency attunes us to read their inscribed histories and memories. In this sense, it's not just metaphorical to say, for example, that rivers, trees, and fungi carry mnemonic inscriptions that accumulate over generations. The awareness of such ecological haunting comes with an imperative that requires humans to take responsibility and embrace an ethics of care. Let's begin, however, with specific environmental crises that can be experienced viscerally around the globe. First and foremost, of course, there is the climate crisis that includes accelerated global warming, the heat waves, deadly heat waves, as we know, have happened in the US, South Asia, Europe, the Middle East. Catastrophic fires occur across the globe. We are facing the loss of ice in Greenland and the Antarctic, and so on and so on. As I wrote this, the streets of Los Angeles were flooded and cars were floating through them like stranded ships. We also know the Amazonian rainforest is approaching the tipping point. Catastrophic mega fires have been seen in the southwest US, China, the Middle East, the Sahel region, and so on. Finally, the overall framework of haunted ecologies encompasses the impact of the current wars, especially in Gaza and the Ukraine, not only on and actually I wrote this before the Iraq war, the Iran war. So that has to be added, not only on the material ecologies, but also on the ecology of mind of the affected people. According to Elizabeth Colbert, all these entangled events and crises create the specter that is haunted ecologies today, namely extinction. Tracing the evolution of the human species in The Sixth Extinction, the title of her book, Colbert links the beginning of anthropogenic climate change to the discovery of subterranean resources. This discovery eventually propelled the onset of extractive economies and wars over resources. After the 5 catastrophic extinction events on the planet, the 6th mass extinction we are facing right now is the first one caused by, according to Colbert, by the species of Homo sapiens. While Colbert emphasizes the role of the human species in mass extinction events, Jason Moore refocuses the debates about the Anthropocene on capitalism as the main culprit. Capitalism's extractive politics extends beyond the extraction of resources to include human labor. Like Latour, but with a different focus, Moore refuses the split between society and nature and links racialized colonialism to the same historical processes as climate change and ecological destruction. And finally, Joseph Masco responds to the debates about the Anthropocene in an article titled The Six Extinctions. He opens his reflections on the ecological calamity in the 21st century by casting it as a blowback of capitalist industrialization. Technologically mediated, the current mass extinction is, according to Masco, used by nations, states, and institutions as a mode of governance that organizes both politics and affects. Masco's emphasis on the use of the sixth extinction to govern affects constitutes a major intervention in current political attempts to shape the ecology of mind. Environmental discourses not only analyze the threat of planetary destruction, they also try to generate and regulate affects as well as behavior and environmental action, according to Masco. And for me, this becomes particularly evident in discourses on pollution and toxicity. I skip a whole paragraph on going into detail about polluted rivers around the globe, air pollution around the globe. But I do mention now toxic electronic wastes are dumped in Africa and Southeast Asia, and the extraction of lithium, cobalt, and nickel continues to harm local ecologies, including air quality. Environmental artist and activist Thomas Saraceno developed an entire project that engages with lithium extraction in the region of Salina Grandes in Argentina. In an art event titled Fly with Erosine Pacha, Saraceno launched a giant aerosolar balloon powered only by solar heat and wind to explore fossil-free mobility. The balloon was inscribed with the message, "Water and life are worth more than lithium." Saraceno collaborated with indigenous communities of the area whose land, water, air, and cultural heritage are harmed by industrial lithium extraction. Finally, it is also worth mentioning, especially since AI is the only thing that can save us, it's worth mentioning that the enormous waste produced, created from the production of AI, is one of the major factors in the fallout of extractive economies. Trash mountains are already proliferating outside of urban centers, especially in Latin America and South Asia. In my last chapter, the documentary Estamira, by Marcos Prado's documentary Estamira, will serve as a paradigmatic example to analyze this new trash ecology. I don't know, is that documentary pretty well known or not? It describes the life of a woman who lives on a trash mountain outside Rio de Janeiro. It's the largest trash mountain in the world, and she lives merely by scavenging discarded food, discarded objects that she uses for her housing and so on. It's very interesting. You can see it on YouTube, and I see her as a parallel, today's equivalent of what Freud analyzed with the Schreber case. Her madness, in a way, holds a mirror up to the madness of our culture and society today, just like Schreber's madness did for his own time. So these examples show how profoundly humans are impacted by ecological crises and catastrophes. Some climate models predict that up to 1-2 billion people could be displaced by climate change by 2050. Many indigenous people have already lost their land due to extractive colonial and neo-colonial politics. Many economic refugees risk their lives to flee to countries where they have a chance to make a living, and many political refugees seek asylum in countries where their freedom is not threatened. And probably most of you experience it with your own students, or you students experience it with your peers. I have many students who currently who are threatened by deportation, who fear deportation. Some of our students no longer come to campus out of the fear of being deported, even though our administration, including the campus police, have promised that they will not let ICE come onto the ground. But the fear is there. So a few years ago, before the new wars of the century overshadowed our entire world, I wrote that nuclearism and climate change present the two major dangers that jeopardize the future of planetary life. I still believe this is true. Climate change affects our subjectivity, especially through events we can already viscerally experience. If we follow Marx in assuming that species being is always determined by specific social and historical conditions, we might wonder whether we have finally reached the stage at which the massive intervention into the order of things forces us to recognize the entanglement of the fate of humans with that of the environment and other species. As sensuous beings, humans share vulnerability and mortality with other species and are dependent on sustainable environments. The extent to which human civilizations and capitalism have threatened the life of the planet by exploiting its resources demands a new responsibility and obligation to care. The deep impact on humans of nuclearism and climate change, as well as zones of abandonment. I use this term from João Bill, but I would add zones of misery, hunger, and death, generates new forms of sociality and subjectivity. Felix Guattari sees the production of subjectivity and its processes of singularization and resingularization as a major driving force in ecology, or as he calls it, ecosophy, reminding us that, quote, it is not only species that are becoming extinct, but also the words, phrases, and gestures of human solidarity. Ecology then encompasses theoretical, ethico-political, and aesthetic aspects, and, as Guattari demands, questions the whole of subjectivity and capitalistic power formations. I think I will just stop here, even though I'm in the middle of my talk, but so that we have a little bit time for discussion. But you also see those of you who have time to come tomorrow. I end with Guattari, why I chose Felix Guattari's text for a seminar tomorrow and for a discussion tomorrow. Thanks.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Questions?
Okay, so this is not so much about the second part of your talk, where you're talking about your book, but about the more recent part. And actually, a question that I've been asking myself and that you bring up, among other things, there's so many things I want to talk about, but which is this constant comparison in the U.S. right now to Germany. To Nazi Germany, which you brought up as well.
Yeah.
And you actually seem to be affirmative,
Yeah.
supportive of it. I have been trying to think about why this is. I think one reason is because that's really all people learn in the United States when they go to K through 12 about history. It's the Holocaust, and of course they learn it in a very, very, very reductive way, which in so many ways I don't want to get into, but which I think actually makes the comparison. I have a lot of problems with the comparison, so I just want you to kind of maybe. And since this is really kind of how your work started, or one of the things that you've been thinking about a lot, I know, maybe some more thoughts about the complexity of this comparison, if it's really helpful. And I just want to throw in there, I've been thinking way more about parallels with other cultural parallels or historical parallels that I think people are not as aware of. Let's just say Latin America, for example. Okay.
Yeah. That's could have a long answer, but I give you the short one. The first, each time I talked to a larger group of people about fascism in the US today, someone said, "Oh, you're concluding this because you are German, and you know, but the US is very different from Germany. The US has firm laws that would prohibit all the things that happened in Germany. No, we don't have fascism here." People are very resistant to acknowledging that what we are seeing today here in the US is a form of fascism. Now, I'm not saying that, yeah, also people, also people on the left cautioned that we know we cannot say this is defeatism, we don't acknowledge it yet. We have a strong left, yet we don't. So, but it's the argument is all, and I said there are fascisms all over the world. There are many fascist countries all over the world. But I do think, and I mentioned the two examples, I do think it's no coincidence that Elon Musk did a Hitler salute. And I do not think it's a coincidence that Hohmann wears a Nazi-style coat. The symbolic, the iconography of the current movement goes and shows that it's Germany. But also, I mean, there's other, how did Hitler come to power, you know? And the January 6th insurrection, we can think about a lot of parallels with, yeah, of course, I always hear, oh yeah, but the US doesn't have concentration camps like Germany. No, it's wrong. The US has concentration camps. And they incarcerate people there. So far, they have no gas chambers, luckily, you know. But they have incarcerated children in death camps that are not far from where I live in California, around the Mexican borders, and many children died there because of neglect and because of lack of medical treatment. So these are the things that are at the back of my comparison.
We've been reading some Lembe.
Oh yeah,
in
yeah.
Seminar, and if we take the paradigm of necropolitics as urgent, vital, unintended, or paradox intended, do we also take Mbembe's subsequent work, I'm thinking of the earthly community, and this notion of community and how we build community in a post-pandemic or ecologically catastrophic world, isn't it imperative upon us? I mean, I don't want to return to the what is to be done question, but I do want to return to the what is to be done question. To also think about ways of, I'll use Tim Morton's word that he uses, redeem, save. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. No, I think probably, I think this is the most crucial point, that we at least pose the question and try to answer it in different. I don't have a good answer to what is to be done, but I think it's the most crucial question. And I'm actually in conversation with Achille about the necropolitics and what is to be done. And he at one point said, the hardest thing for me is that the answer to this question that I try to come up with changes every month because new things happen politically. And this is something right now. I recently, a few days ago, talked to my older son, who is an anthropologist and works on refugee situations, and we talked about the Iran, the current war, and he said, this is the first time I literally have a feeling I don't have a sense where this could go in so many directions. I don't have a clear sense of how to analyze it and where to do. That's part of, right now, I also feel that every day when I listen to the news, I have more questions than answers and not a real solid analysis yet. And I think that's just my confession now. Yeah. There was also someone.
I had promised myself that I wasn't going to talk today. No, seriously, these days I don't want to say anything. I don't want to talk. I just want to stay silent.
Yeah.
And I think the best thing these days is to stay silent in most parts. I'm from a country that is right now being bombed. Before that, we've got a country of more than 40,000 people being massacred.
Yeah.
And the ecology of death
Yeah.
is more than real.
Mm-hmm.
The pollution in Tehran right now is at a point where the young kids are dying aside from the bombs and from everything else. So the question I had was actually this question that I'm having myself, because some of our young students are calling me, mostly Iranians. Sorry, these days I can't really keep very calm, and screaming their heads off what to do. And if it's not asking Trump to go and bomb, what else we want to do? And they're very angry at in their idea of being the left and not being able to do anything. So I try to convince them that the question of urgency does not mean the fast answer and rushing to action. At times, that the urgency requires ambiguity. At times, the moral response is actually realize that we do not have a response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that Allah for the fatigue, for this destruction to find ways. Unfortunately, most of the time we have to right away respond. So the question I have is exactly this, that something I'm trying to really get my head around, how one responds to the situations and the world that is so destructive. And it's almost that it's ruins, about, and it's so urgent to do something, and yet almost any response at this point seems to be leading to other forms of destructions. How do we, and where do we stand in relation to that? That's one question. The second question was the question of madness. I feel like you said something about, and it reminded me of actually Stefania Pandolfo's work, that madness nowadays itself is a form of morality and moral existence. Because being calm, yesterday we had an event and we were reading something, and I was supposed to lead that conversation, and I tried to say something, and at some point I realized we are so world apart. All I was trying to say was, can we allow our skins to be to get rid of those boundaries and be able to feel the other bodies and the other lives and the other realities. Would we ever, I mean, just, I know it was completely a Freudian slip, but would we ever make a mistake between the US and Canada?
Yeah.
But Iran and Iraq, or Iran and Libya, Iran and what, they don't matter. They don't matter. We can actually say Iran or Iraq because they don't matter.
Yeah.
Is that right? Iran and Iraq can fight for 8 years. Who cares? But one American cannot die. God forbid. Of course shouldn't die. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But so, sorry, I'm going on and on. But the question for me is how we respond to situations, from ecological situations to others, that are so urgent.
Yeah.
And yet, seems that any response, any action seems to be just another way of leading to more destructions and more violence. Where do you stand in relation to that?
Mm. Well, you know, I agree. I agree with most of what you said, except with, you started out with saying that today you think sometimes that the best way is to be silent. That for me is almost like a taboo, you know. I do not think we can afford to stay silent. Of course we can, but going back to some of the things you brought about the Iranian community, I was in LA and there's 2 parallel demonstrations going on all the time now in the Iranian community in LA. Part of them are demonstrating against the war, and the others are jubilant that Khomeini is killed and jubilant of Trump and cheering Trump and so on. We saw not as extreme, but we saw similar things after Maduro's capture in Venezuela. So that's also something I think it's very, we haven't seen that so often in, I mean, most of the people, you mentioned the left, you know, most of the people at that, on the left were more or less, at least had different opinions, but were at the came out on the same point, the side of how to relate to a political event, not today. And that is also something specific that I find important. I'm thinking about it also, the question of what to do, you know, what is to be done. Sometimes I think along the lines of Donna Haraway's old staying with the trouble. Perhaps that means today also staying with ambiguity, but also staying with questions. I ended the earlier intervention saying I have more questions than answers these days, and staying with the question is perhaps important. Not always already have, you know, and that has something to do how we work with theory. I mean, yes, of course, we can come up with a orthodox Marxist analysis, or we can come up with a Nietzschean reading, or we can come up with, I think it also, what we need right now is not apply the pre-existing theories, but use them as tools to inform our questions. That's more or less how I see it. But I think there was a question. You had a question also.
And my question was, when I heard the terms like affect and necropolitics, I was wondering, what are what are the relationship between the necropolitics and affect? Because like I was saying, then is affect like legitimizing the necropolitics or delegitimizing, destabilizing necropolitics, or do they serve as a structure or kind of dynamics? So I just wanted to, could you just expand more about the relationship between two? I was digesting.
Yeah. I think if I go back to Achilles' essay, he doesn't dwell much and he doesn't say much on affect. You can think it's certain affective dynamics are implied, but it's not where he wants to go with this. He has a more traditional political analysis in that, but I think it would be very good to ask, where does our affects, our politics of emotions, even our political unconscious come in when we think about current necropolitics, especially when it comes to the so-called work of death. You know, how do we position ourselves to it? The one part in my talk where I tried to push that a little was when I asked all these questions about how do we relate to these disappeared children? How do we, where is a kind of that would, for me, demand a collective outcry, you know, that would demand, now more confessional. At one point I thought, if this had happened in the 60s, we would have all been in the street, you know, and they wouldn't have gotten away with having this under the radar and having it silenced. That's, by the way, why I think to remain silent is not an option. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can only say yes, I think it's important to think about it, but it's a good idea to link necropolitics with affect and affect theories. I would go in the direction of psychoanalysis more than affect theory, because I think the unconscious, the political unconscious, is very crucial at the moment.
That is talking about transgender death in Turkey. And you want to kind of take a look at, she doesn't go into details of affects, but she talks about the way emotions become involved in this relation of someone who's transgender but is not yet registered completely as male or female, and then it becomes very difficult for the government, the family, and all these institutions involved, and the community of the transgender community. So it's a kind of very interesting, because there is, on the one hand, on the institutional level, on the other hand is the community and the individual and the intimate. So you may want to kind of take a look at, it may be helpful, I don't know.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Gabriele
Thanks
Schwab,
all of you for the questions.
For all the questions. Okay. Also to Gregg Lambert in the back. Very generous.